Welcome back, Honors. Welcome back to your Flip Classroom and our discussion about how we're wrapping up this Protestant Reformation, right? We are wrapping up the Protestant Reformation, and we finished up the Protestant Reformation in England today in class. Y'all are studs. We did that artwork quiz. I'm going to get those graded and back to you as fast as I humanly and possibly can, but we're not here to talk about that right now. We are here to talk about this Reformation, how it's blowing up, what directions it's going in, what it's doing, and all this different stuff. So we focused a lot today in England, right? We talked about how Henry VIII is going to start the Protestant church, mostly for political power, and then also for the growth of monarchical power during this time period. And then also he's going to have 6 wives. Divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived, right? And he's going to also later on have 3 surviving children. Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth. Edward rules first, but he dies at the age of 15 from tuberculosis, then tries to pass the throne on to Lady Jane Grey. That doesn't go so well because this lady enters the picture. Of course, her name being Mary Tudor. Mary Tudor, who stayed devoutly Catholic, as we see from that cross on her brooch right there. She returned England to Catholicism when she came into power after she executed that woman known as Lady Jane Grey. Lady Jane Grey, of course, the 9 days queen, is only going to be on the throne for a little while, mainly just because Edward tried to give it to her rather than giving it to Mary, right? So what ends up going down, though, in the long run, Mary comes in, tries to transfer England completely back to Catholicism, right? And in the process, she executes and burns at the stake several hundred Protestants, right? Over 300 different Protestants were burned at the stake for not converting back to the Catholicism away from the Church of England, right? Which is intense, and that's going to earn her the nickname Bloody Mary, right? But really quickly, though, she doesn't rule for that long. She only rules for like a handful of years, about 6 or 7 years when she comes into power, because she was already like in her 30s by the time that she actually came to power. So she didn't rule for too long and ends up dying, right? We'll talk about her in a later unit as well, how she's going to get married to the King of Spain named Philip II, and Philip II and her are never going to actually have children, and that's why she never had anything to pass down to. She actually had a phantom pregnancy at one point. She believed so ardently that she was pregnant. Her stomach actually swelled, her menstrual cycle stopped, and stuff like that. It was a whole thing. But now, going forward, though, after she dies, who then takes over? Queen Elizabeth. Queen Elizabeth, though, the Virgin Queen, of course, right? The person that Virginia is named after, the woman that never got married, is going to do her best to split England from the Church of England, right? She split the Church of England and tried to take religion and the state and separate them. And she's going to be the last ruler of the Tudors, right? And then she will die and it'll eventually pass to another family, right? But that's a big thing we can review tomorrow morning. Now look, getting into it, we got one other major reformer that's going to come along that's going to send ripples throughout the rest of European history, and we will end up talking about these people quite a few different times, right? The other major reformer is a man by the name of John Calvin, right? John Calvin is going to show up much later, though, right? So Martin Luther starts his Reformation in 1517 and dies in the 1540s. Well, as in 1530, Henry VIII creates the Church of England. Well, in 1534, a crazy event goes down where John Calvin feels unsafe in his native land of France, right? So really quick to give you a heads up, John Calvin is from France, right? And they're being ruled over by a very Catholic ruler, a guy named Francis I, right? Francis I, the Valois family, is extremely Catholic and keeps talking down and keeps preventing the spread of Protestantism in France. And then one night, out of nowhere, there was this event called the Affair of the Placards, right? And what that means is basically like the event of the placards. Well, what a placard is it's like a poster, right? It's like a poster, you know what I'm talking about? It's a placard, right? So now, the big thing about it, though, is what happened was in the Affair of the Placards, overnight in Paris and also all over France, a series of posters popped up all over the place saying that the Catholic Church was bad, that Protestantism was the way to go, that Francis was the devil, and all this other stuff. One of these posters even popped up on his bedchamber door. Not John Calvin's, but Francis's bedchamber door, which is crazy, which means that they had to get past guards to just stick it on there. Now, the way it goes, though, is that Francis I then begins a campaign of arresting and executing any suspected Protestants. Well, John Calvin, fearing for his life, runs away. He runs away from France and he moves to Switzerland, right, where he actually creates this thing known as Calvinism, right? And in the city of Geneva, Switzerland, he creates his new version of the Protestant faith. The biggest thing that you need to understand about Calvin and Calvinists, though, is one, you've met some Calvinists before and you don't even realize it. You met them when you were in elementary school. You just don't call them Puritans. You called them pilgrims. And a lot of you are reading a story or have read a story called The Crucible that has Calvinists in it, right? Puritans are Calvinists and stuff like that. And from what you know already about Puritans and Calvinists and things like that, John Calvin and the faith that he begins and starts up actually is going to have a super strict moral code, an aggressively strict moral code, right? Where they are going to believe and preach this one giant concept known as predestination. Predestination is kind of what Calvinism hinges on. What that is it's the idea that they believe that God knows where you're going to go before you're even born. Whether you will go to hell or go to heaven. Knows your entire life, every mistake, triumph, everything you're going to do, because he is an omniscient power and being, right? And they believe that they are the chosen few that will actually ascend into heaven, and predestination is a very aggressive ideology, right? It basically kind of eliminates the concept of free will that Catholics do believe in, right? And so with this predestination idea of God knows what's going to happen to you before you're even born, they also outline a very strict moral code for their societies, right? They're like, we are the chosen Calvinist few that are going to ascend into heaven and things like that. And in their society, a lot of really aggressive things happens with the strict moral code. Write this little list, because all these things, if you lived in a Calvinist city, would have been illegal, right? So the following things, if you lived in a Calvinist city, if you were Puritan, if you were in the Crucible, if you were in the Scarlet Letter, if you existed as a Presbyterian, well, not a Presbyterian, Scott still drank, but still, you understand what I'm saying. The big thing about it in general, though, is Calvinists believe that a lot of things in their society should be outlawed. Things like bright-colored clothing, drinking, singing, dancing in public, games for children, decks of cards, the Halloween, like all these things that ever distract, theater, pubs, taverns, like all these different things would have to be outlawed. So basically, no fun. You're just not allowed to have any fun whatsoever in a Calvinist setting. But what's going to happen also is church attendance is required. You could receive a fine or like an actual like ticket for not going to church in a Calvinist society. And the big thing about it, like I said, is predestination means that God knows what's going to happen to you before you're even born. But what we're trying to get at with this is we're just bringing up Calvinists because we're going to talk about them a lot more later, in later units, right? Because we're going to have massive ripple effects going forward. Now, this part I'm going to move through real quick due to the fact that you've learned about it already in Mr. Mathern's class. The bulk of your Reformation discussion that you had in Mr. Mathern's class really kind of went around this entire concept, right? It focused around the concept of reforming the Catholic Church. Because during the Protestant Reformation, when Luther shows up, when Calvin shows up, when Henry VIII breaks away, as you can see, a lot of crazy stuff is happening. In a few short years, within 20 years of European history, you're going to have 3 brand new types of Christianity pop up, be it Calvinist, or like if you extend it 100 years, it's 4 if you include the Hussites, Calvinist, Church of England or Anglican, and then also the Lutherans, right? So the Catholic Church, under the leadership of a very important person, jot his name down. His name was Pope Paul III by this point, because Leo X had already died. But in this entire process, by this point in history, Pope Paul III looks at the Catholic Church and he's like, you know what, guys? Maybe it's not them. Maybe it's us, right? So, and they decide under Pope Paul III, who's an hilarious guy, by the way. Pope Paul III is the same one that laughed in that cardinal's face whenever Michelangelo painted him in hell, you know what I mean, in the Last Judgment with a snake and all that stuff, right? Pope Paul III led the Counter-Reformation, and he said it is high time that the church look inward and fix itself. And at a giant set of meetings, because it wasn't just one meeting, it was multiple meetings, at this meeting that is actually drawn in this thing right here was known as the Council of Trent. And at the Council of Trent, that I know you learned about in Mr. Mathern's class because I've talked to him about it numerous times, the Council of Trent was a series of meetings that were made to fix Catholicism. What are some things they're going to do, you ask? Oh, that's a great question right there, Megan Wolf. So some big things that come out of the Council of Trent are ones like priest training. They want to try and create a system to train priests in a more effective manner. Make sure they can speak Latin. Make sure they're not mumbling at Mass. Make sure they're not getting into the priesthood, so for financial gain, pluralism, simony, or nepotism, right? Another big one is not no indulgences, but they're going to outlaw the sale of indulgences, right? That's going to be a huge thing that comes out of the Council of Trent. Women are going to be brought in to work and help educate people, creating Catholic schools, and another huge one is the Inquisition. Now, I always like to include that one right there, the Inquisition, just to show people the Council of Trent was not perfect, right? The Inquisition was still a court that tried people for heresy and crimes against the church and would sometimes torture and or execute them, right? And that's not a thing that actually is very appropriate. So the Council of Trent wasn't perfect, right? There were still some things that held on in the 1500s, of course, because it was an archaic time period and stuff like that, going back 500 years ago, when things were still not completely right. Also, another big thing they didn't do is they didn't recognize Lutheranism, Calvinism, or the Church of England as legitimate churches, right? So the other thing, though, the last thing that you need to know is also new orders are going to be established, right? And what I mean by orders is I mean orders like these, right? Groups of priests or nuns that will have specific tasks or duties that they want to go out and do, right? And these are guys are coming out of the Council of Trent. One of the most famous groups of nuns that were started after the Council of Trent was a group of nuns who even had a sect of them in New Orleans. A group of nuns that are all about creating schools, healing the sick, and being of community service. And they were called the Ursuline nuns. And those Ursuline nuns created Ursuline Academy, right? So now, they are one of the orders that was established from the Council of Trent. Another famous one, of course, is the Jesuits, right? Why do Jesuit boys act the way that they do, right? Why do they do these things? Why do they wear that uniform? Why do they have to make sure their shoes are tied? Why do their hair can only be a certain length? Did you know Mr. Mathern actually also apparently got in trouble one time for his hair being too long at Jesuit? The big thing about it, why does Mr. Roderson always go why aren't your shoes tied? Because Jesuits were started by a monk that came out of the Council of Trent. And his name was St. Ignatius of Loyola. Well, St. Ignatius of Loyola was tasked by the Council of Trent of creating a new sect of monks that actually had a militaristic-like stance on things. Extreme discipline. Why is this? It's because St. Ignatius of Loyola was in the military whenever he began to actually convert to becoming a priest, right? So the thing that ended up happening is he got shot in the leg with a cannonball, and he couldn't get out of his bed. And since he couldn't physically work out, he's like, you know what? I'll mentally work out. And he'd pick up his Bible every single day, and he would do a set of Psalms and basically try to memorize the entire Bible every single day. And he became very closely connected with his faith. And he believed that monks should actually run themselves more like the military, have extreme discipline, be very dedicated to their tasks, and be trying to spread Christianity and education all over the world, right? And they're going to take Christianity and education to new places and new colonies. That's why we have Jesuit High School right here in New Orleans. But that's why those guys have to be so disciplined, because it's what they're all about. It's what they were founded upon. And this right here, it's the last thing, y'all. The biggest thing now is coming out of it is just the religious and social effects of the Reformation, okay? And what they are is pretty quick. Christianity, it's going to spread, right? The new orders like the Ursulines and the Jesuits are going to help spread Christianity to new areas. And also Christianity is going to spread because if you actually know anything about history, in 1492, Columbus is going to run into the Caribbean, and we're going to realize that there are two whole new continents there. So Christianity is going to spread to those people as well. Witchcraft also is going to become a really big issue. Of course, especially in Protestant communities. Well, of course, you know that already from reading the Crucible or reading the Scarlet Letter or actually having a class with the Mr. Troy Roddy, right? And then last but not least, political power and church power are going to begin to become separate, and church power is going to begin to fall off a little bit. But that's it. That's the rest of this unit. 12 minutes. Y'all love it. See y'all soon. Y'all have a good one.